For any science, I think it's very important to see the history of the discipline, to see who did what in the past to get you where you are today as far as the background of the particular science. And so I put this section in here to talk a little bit about things that I think are important in the history of dinosaur studies. And notice that some of these are duplicated in the optional textbook, but some of them are not. So let's hit a few high points here. The first, right off the bat, is a name that a lot of people don't associate, even among dinosaur groups, with this study, and that is Robert Plot. He's the person that described the very, very first dinosaur bone. And look at that date there, 1676, a long time ago. And what you're looking at is the lower end of a thigh bone. So that'd be the long leg bone where it touches the knee. And some of you that know your bones can recognize that immediately. But now this is a specimen that is lost. People have searched for this all over museums in England and elsewhere in Europe, but we can't find it. It'd be very important and nice to have, but we don't have it. Here's some actual words. There's a quote from Robert Plot. And notice he was already thinking that this is something that's kind of interesting. So, if then they are neither the bones of horse, oxen, nor elephants, as I am strongly persuaded they are not, upon comparison, and from their likes found in churches, it remains, notwithstanding their extravagant magnitude, they must have been the bones of men or women. Again, this is where this sort of falls in line with a lot of other sort of myths or early ideas, misguided ideas of giant human beings or giant races. So clearly the hypothesis was wrong, but let's think about why he might have been led astray. And here's a couple of toys to look at this. So there's a human skeleton and an elephant skeleton, a smaller elephant skeleton, relatively sized, properly mounted, all the bones in the right place. But if you were to collapse that elephant skeleton down and lay it flat on the ground as if an elephant died and laid there, it might lay itself out, and it certainly does. They do a lot of the times to lay themselves out, and it would look like a weird race of giant humans. And so these same mistakes were made repeatedly by different cultures in ancient times, but then, as you see there, as recently as the 1600s, by humans here thinking that these were the bones of ancient humans. Interestingly enough, he named this species Scrotum humanum because he thought it was a fossilized giant scrotum, a ball sack. That officially should be the name that has priority for this first dinosaur species, but it's been largely X'd out and isn't used. William Buckland, he's an interesting fellow. He found one of the very first dinosaurs and described it in a fully taxonomic style. Today we know this thing as Megalosaurus, but he didn't give it a name, but he did certainly publish the detailed description of it. He's important for a lot of things, and right off the bat, I owe him the name of my job. He invented the term paleontology and was, as you see there, connected with Charles Lyell, very famous geologist, Charles Darwin, etc. Buckland himself was a very, very weird fellow, a person that lived with animals. He had all kinds of different animals living with him in his house, and he was famous for attempting to eat as many different species of animals as he could find. A lot of history books, though, for dinosaurs start with the Mantells, Gideon Mantell and his wife. He was a dentist, and on one of his jobs, sort of riding out to take care of people's teeth, she found this tooth, and they sent this tooth to Cuvier, but he thought it was from an ancient rhinoceros. When Gideon looked at this in greater detail, he thought that this looked more like the teeth of an iguana. And so he described it and named it as iguanodon, which literally translates as iguana tooth, but certainly a giant iguana tooth. And then, of course, the big one, the first big name in dinosaur studies, Sir Richard Owen, he came up with the name. So Dinosauria literally translates as terrible reptiles. He did recognize these things were not lizards, but advanced quadrupedal organisms. And so he came up with the idea that the reptiles that we see today, the lizards, snakes, turtles, these little things, are simply degenerated has-beens. They had a great ancestry of giants, and today they are these miserable little things here. To come over to the United States, we've got Joseph Leidy. This is the first described dinosaur from the United States, New Jersey, 1868. So the same year that UW Whitewater opened up as the Whitewater Normal School, here in New Jersey, they were describing the very first dinosaurs from North America. This one was called Hadrosaurus, which literally translates as the heavy lizard. And clearly this, though, was a definitely bipedal organism and very modified. He had a good amount of things. And you can see the reconstruction here. A lot of these early reconstructions always want to stand them up sort of like we stand. Okay. Now, into some of the big names of later collecting. Here's Edward Drinker Cope. He's a huge, huge name in dinosaurology simply because of that number right there, over 1,400 scientific publications. That's huge. And his arch nemesis, Othniel Charles, or O.C. Marsh. So both of these fellas operated in the mid to late 1800s. They came from rival East Coast museums, but they didn't work in the East Coast. Both of them were active in the West. So they went out west each year and collected dinosaurs. They were involved in what's now become called the dinosaur wars. They were actively shooting at each other. They would hire soldiers and all kinds of vigilante types on the side to either guard or steal or raid each other's sites and dinosaurs. Sort of bad news in that sense, but it meant that because of this rivalry and this intense competition, both Cope and Marsh brought back thousands and thousands of specimens of dinosaurs to these East Coast museums and really introduced dinosaurs as a big thing, a big ancient group to the rest of the world, especially in America, but the rest of the world as well. Now, here's a guy that you don't really see too much in dinosaur history books, Edward Hitchcock. He was a president of a small college in the East, and he created or started the whole science of what we call ichnology. So the study of fossil tracks. He also was one of the very first people to recognize fossil poop as coprolites. And so he worked kind of on the fringes of dinosaurology. He didn't study the actual bones, but he studied the other remains. And so if you think about it, if you or I were to walk on a beach, we'd leave a set of footprints. I'm not there. I left, I went home for the day, but the footprints remain, so it is evidence of an organism being there. And so it is certainly something that's still important. When he looked at a lot of these dinosaur footprints that he saw in the East, he noticed that, okay, they look like bird footprints, but they're giant. And so he thought, oh, these were these giant birds that they missed the ark. They didn't get on the ark or Noah's ark, and so they died. They didn't make it. You can't talk about the history of dinosaur studies without the sad tale of the Tendaguru expeditions. So in the early 1900s, the science of dinosaur studies was advancing beyond England and the Americas. So now you had other first world countries doing this, and in particular, Germany sent a lot of its paleontologists around the globe to get dinosaurs. And their efforts in Africa took them to Tanzania, where they removed, as you see there, tons and tons of material. This is still on display and also back in the collections, and some of it not even fully processed, in the Berlin Museum of Natural History. And these things were taken in an area where there were clearly not any roads or advanced communication systems. And so sadly, these German paleontologists used slave labor to remove these bones, literally pick up these tons of material and hike them, walk tons of material for many, many days to the oceans where they hopped on boats and eventually made it to Berlin. So a sad tale, but it certainly brought us a lot of great dinosaurs. And if you're ever in Berlin, those are just tremendous dinosaurs to see. Really exceptional. And then finally, as a Wisconsin paleontologist, I can't not talk about R.C. Andrews. He's a Beloit, Wisconsin boy that ultimately became one of the centerpieces of the American Museum of Natural History's scientific crew. And in the 1920s, just like the German expeditions to Tanzania, the whole thought was that, hey, the world's open to us. If we can get there, we can look for dinosaurs, get them, take them, and bring them back. They didn't use slave labor, happily, but they certainly went to what's today Mongolia as part of these Central Asiatic expeditions and brought back all kinds of wonderful dinosaurs, including the first evidence of eggs, that dinosaurs were organisms that laid eggs. Now, he was a swashbuckling character. You see him there with his fat fedora, his boots, his sleeves are rolled up, there's a rifle nearby, and he was the inspiration for the character of Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, who was an archaeologist, but R.C. Andrew was the archetype for this thing. In Beloit, there is actually still an R.C. Andrews Society to try to preserve the memory of R.C. Andrews, and every year they give an award to outstanding paleontologists that do this sort of swashbuckling international collecting type thing. It's pretty interesting stuff. And so there's so many other characters in the early history of dinosaurology, but I wanted to hit a few high points. Yes, it is important for you to know these names of these gentlemen and what they are associated with, what they accomplished.